recommendations to spend more money on security at LAX. Does LA have the money to do it?
Well, as I'm sure you know, there are many different sources of funding for the City of Los Angeles. There's the general fund, of course, but I mentioned there are these roughly about 1,000 special funds, including 500 of them which are special revenue funds. And these are monies that may come from the federal government, from the state, from a variety of different grants. So it's not so much just how much the City of Los Angeles has at any given moment to pay for it, but also what the various funding sources may be. That's the first. The second is that you have to obviously invest money in security and in making LAX the best possible airport that it can be. It is a huge source of an economic engine to the region and to Los Angeles, of course, as well. And you have to make investments in security and everything else. I'm not an expert on security, but this evaluation will be done. And if there is a need, then I would imagine that there are going to be ways found to find that money. Hopefully there will be.
Mike Feuer, have the lawsuits started coming in yet as a result of that incident? And do you anticipate that there are going to be a lot of them?
The answer is no, they have not. And I don't, because I think that it's going to be quite difficult for one to determine that the city had any liability. But that's just the beginning of what this incident teaches us, I think. Among other lessons is the continuing scourge of gun violence that confronts us almost every day. And, you know, when I ran for this job, I said that I was going to create a team in our office that was riveted on making the city attorney's office not just a leader locally, but in the nation on preventing gun violence. And I've named somebody to do that. And let me just share with you in the early stages what that looks like in practical terms. We're already working with the police department to assure that a perpetrator of domestic violence doesn't have a gun in his home. We're working to assure that people who are prohibited from having weapons don't have them, and when we find that they do, we're going to prosecute them, and we're going to pursue work with our partners in the justice system to prevent others who ought not have weapons from having them. For me, this is a cause. It's not merely an aspect of my job. And although it often takes a tragedy to galvanize a community or a nation, when the moment passes, momentum seems to dissipate. And I can tell you that from my office, there is a firm commitment from me personally that our focus on this issue is not going to dissipate. And I just want to say quickly, Warren, a couple of quick examples about what I found in the community on this issue. I was speaking before I took office at a church south of downtown. Maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people were there that day, and I asked them to stand if their lives had been touched by gun violence, and half of them stood. When the mayor and I were at Dorsey High School in the wake of the George Zimmerman verdict, I asked the kids who were assembled there if their lives had been touched by gun violence, and about 80% of the kids raised their hands. Then I was at a small community meeting in Eagle Rock about a month ago, and a woman said to me, I should not have to move from the bedroom at the front of my apartment to the back of the building to avoid stray bullets as I had to do last week. And she is right. She should not have to do that. So I'm looking forward to a lot more teamwork on this issue, which the events at the airport, again, highlight for all of us.
But who's going to do it? Who's going to make sure? Who's going to make sure that the perpetrator of gun violence doesn't still have a gun in his home? Who's going to monitor those situations?
It's a great question.
Is that going to be the LAPD?
We have a partnership with PD, and let's talk what that looks like. When I was on the city council, I wrote a number of laws on gun violence prevention, including a requirement that we maintain a log of who purchases ammunition. Why do we do that? Because the police department compares the purchasers of ammunition against lists of prohibited purchasers. And just a few weeks ago, they were out at a scene collecting weapons from people who ought not have them because they derived evidence from these ammo logs. And now, as you probably have seen, there's a pending ordinance in the city council and a pilot project underway at police department to require that ammunition sellers electronically transmit that information to the police department so they can be on top of the scene. Then we prosecute these cases because almost every gun violence prevention measure, from the ban on the sale of high-capacity magazines to the limitation that one can't purchase more than one gun a month so you don't have illegal weapons trafficking, can be prosecuted as a misdemeanor. So it takes real teamwork here. And I have to tell you that the police department has been a remarkably receptive partner on this issue in the first few months I've been in office.
Mr. Mayor, I know you want to speak. Let me ask you a question as you get ready to do so. One of the things that Mike Bonin is quoted as saying by the Daily Breeze is that there was a panel of experts that made safety and security recommendations about LAX in 2011. He wants to see those recommendations and find out if they were, in fact, put into effect. You're in charge. What about it?
Thank you. Mayor Eric Garcetti had a blue ribbon commission on airport security. We have directed, and the commission is already working on the implementation of those, some of which were implemented, some of the suggestions, some of which were not. And I want to know as mayor why the ones that weren't implemented, why that's the case. We'll be driving this together. Mike will be doing it from the council side. We're going to be doing it from the commission side. And today, in doing the debrief, there are definitely lessons learned. Not just on the operational stuff, which I agree, Mike, but even on security, which isn't to say that they didn't do an amazing job and acted probably about as well as you could have. There's no such thing, Charlie Beck said this, as pitching a perfect game in situations like this. There just isn't. There is no way that you can say, oh my gosh, we had everything perfect. So the lessons that you learn are both in the operational side and the security side. Do we have enough cameras in place? How are we deploying our people? One issue is that I was working on long before this incident, just after I got in, was there's a backlog right now in getting LAPD and LAWA officers through the background check process that exists in our personnel department. These are agencies ready with budgets to hire. We're down LAPD, I think, 99, 20 something right now. We just graduated another class, so we may be back up, but we're supposed to have 10,000 in strength. I don't want to just hit 10,000 every July 1st. I want us to have 10,000 at any given moment. That's what the budget allows for. And so we're looking at creative ways that maybe the police department and LAWA can do their own background checks, make sure through personnel then they've done it the right way, and get 18 more folks hired, for instance, in the LAWA police. All of these things are critically important. We never know what we don't know until we get in there. But we will be issuing a report. I think there's 45 days is what the commission has asked for to get that. And it'll be comprehensive on both the operations and also on the security side. One last thing, we're counting, because gun violence is so important to me as well, together working with Mike and with Chief Beck, we're finally compiling gun statistics in the city of LA, and we're tracking those. That's something I asked for in my first week so that we can see which of those are homicides, which of them are suicides, because gun violence isn't just about homicides. The availability of guns leads to deaths because people use them in suicides. They're not counted usually in crime statistics because we all want to know, well, what's a criminal act, and we see a suicide as a non-criminal act. These things are important to the health and the safety of my city, and I want to make sure that we're covering them, and also continuing to suggest legislation like that fake guns that kids play with should be brightly colored instead of looking exactly like an AK-47. And when a police officer sees a 13-year-old with that and fears for his life and winds up killing them, like happened in Glassell Park near my district a couple years ago, we have to pass laws to make sure that never happens again.
Before we move away from LAX, there are other issues, I think, with the airport that are of great interest to this audience, and the expansion of the airport is one of them.
We can do the whole
and are you, in fact, going to have to move the runways? Is that something that you talked about when you went back to, Mr. Mayor, to Washington? Is it really possible to expand in the way that the FAA wants to do that without that that movement of those runways, which is going to be so disruptive if it happens in this neighborhood?
I've consistently since the campaign said that I oppose doing that. I did not discuss it in Washington, D.C., and it didn't come up. I know there are.
What can you do to stop it?
And I met with Secretary of Transportation and others, and I know there'll be folks that have those opinions, and I'll make the case as to why I have that perspective, and as mayor, what we can do about that. I do think that if we're intellectually honest with ourselves, it's not necessarily a safety issue, which many people have said. We can do the safety thing short of that. Mike has been very articulate on this to make sure that we have greater safety, and we should implement those as part of our planning. But the piece, if you do want to move the runway, that's about the number of passengers we're going to have. It's truly, the only reason somebody could logically justify it to me so far is to say, well, we want to go up to 100 million passengers, and to do that, we need more space, and it's true, you would. Right now we have about 63, 64 million. The things that we support would take us up to 80 million, and this community has actually embraced that as a compromise, which is pretty great for a community to say, look, I'll take, if you add 17 million more, you can do the math, but it's almost, 20% increase. more than 20, it's about 25% increase. That's actually that's not NIMBYs, that's people taking on a willingness to see this economic engine continue to grow. But for all of us, we have to, I think, do the things that this community has been promised. And all of Los Angeles has been promised. I jokingly referred, we had a 100-year anniversary yesterday of the opening of the LA Aqueduct. And we had this great play that was reenacted, and we had William Mulholland himself there, and my predecessor, Fred Eaton, the mayor of Los Angeles. And I said, I come to you from the future, a place where we now have a city that's 4 million people strong, an $850 billion economy, a place where we have a football team and rail to the airport. And I said, well, maybe not those last two. But the things that we haven't done...
You are a dreamer.
Yes. The things that we haven't done, I think we need to do first. And I hope that we can resolve the issue without having to move the runway. But, you know, even if you look at the most aggressive timeline, that's not even going to get through for 7 or 8 years before you'd break ground. So why not get some rail there? Why not improve the traffic? Why not make the terminals great? And then we can talk about what's going to happen after.
Thanks. I just have a sort of genetic inability to not chime in when there's a conversation about LAX. One, ditto everything the mayor just said. It's important to note, and Eric talked a little bit about this, that LAX modernization and moving the runway are not the same thing. This is a community that vigorously supports LAX modernization. That's making the rest of the airport look as good as the Tom Bradley terminal. That's making sure that passengers have a good experience. That's making sure that there's a consolidated rental car center and a people mover and, dear Lord, yes, a train to the airport, so that, one, passengers can have a positive experience. Two, we can reflect a beautiful world-class airport to the world. And three, that we can have the necessary traffic mitigation to handle the capacity that we have and the capacity to come. The other thing that's important to note is that the airport is not in any way obligated to move that runway. The last city council and the last mayor gave preliminary permission to the airport to do it. They would still need to come back for programmatic approval, and even then, they're not obligated. They have permission to do it. They have had permission to do a number of good projects, like the Green Line and the People Mover, for a number of years. So my thing is, let's get moving on that stuff that everybody loves.
We heard a lot at the beginning of the program about how things have changed at City Hall, and one of the things is the opening up of records and the declaration of an age of transparency. Ron Galperin, let me ask you first about the control panel, as you call the mass of numbers that you have put on the internet, and the criticism that it's not really part of an age of transparency so much as an age of spewing, as one reporter called it. That comes from John Rigardi of the Downtown News. A mass of numbers with no perspective. They pose more questions than answers. Why did $1.2 million go to the city of Burbank? Why did $10.98 go to a pipe fitter for the DWP? Why did a clerk typist get $249,000? You don't have the answers. So what are you giving us that we didn't that is helpful in better understanding whether government is working and working well?
Glad you asked that. The fact is...
This is a softball question. I'm not apologizing for it.
No, the fact is that if it wasn't for all those numbers that are now there for everybody to see, you wouldn't even be asking any of these questions. And you would not have any basis to ask the question.
You don't have the answers.
Well, the answers are not all manifest overnight. That's certainly the case. And when you're talking about billions of dollars worth of expenditures, and what we have on the site is we have vendor payments in the billions of dollars. We have a lot of detailed information about payroll for everybody who works for the city of Los Angeles quarter by quarter and broken down with a number of different components. You can do a search by word. You can do a search by vendor. You can have many different ways to view this data. And you can look at fees and fines and penalties, and you can kind of break it down. I'm already taking a lot of this information, and by the way, so are many others in departments. It's not just about sort of the general public, but department managers who haven't had a tool actually to analyze spending in their own departments. And for the first time, they're able to see some of these numbers.
They don't know what's going on in their own departments?
Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. But this allows them to crunch this information in a way that they couldn't do before. We're going to have a lot more information that is available in the very near future. Also, we want to change the way the departments enter the information into the system, because much of it is entered into by those departments, and then we want to have them provide more information, more details, also to provide links between, for example, every vendor expenditure and what the invoice is, and eventually to what the contract was, and even to the RFP or RFQ that was the original source of what all of this was. As well as, by the way, very soon we're going to be adding what fund it comes from, whether it's general fund or whether it's a special fund that funds this, as well as what council authority there was for this specific kind of expenditure. So you're going to get more and more of this kind of information. It's overwhelming. There's no question about it. And some of it is actually confusing. I remember you posed to me a question, why was the city of Los Angeles spending money and writing a check to Rolls-Royce of all things? And it turns out, of course, that Rolls-Royce has commercial engines. We were getting commercial engine parts from them. But there's a good explanation for some of it. Some of it there's less than good explanation. But this is the beginning of understanding the finances in a way that we've never been able to understand them before.
Mr. Mayor, when you were vetting department heads, did you ask them if they knew what was going on in their own department?
Absolutely. And what we've tried to do is say, you have to actually set numerical, measurable, identifiable goals if you're going to continue to be a general manager in the city. Because if you don't, how do I judge them, and in turn, how do you judge me? Now, it's interesting. Both Ron and I, and we meet about kind of data stuff, have launched two different initiatives. One was a beta site that you can go to now that we're growing at lamayor.org/performance, and we're beginning to put performance metrics out. Part of staying on as general manager, or for new general managers, is putting these out. And one of the things we said from the beginning was, these are a work in progress. We're going to hear suggestions from people. What are the measures that matter to you? Is it the clean air? Is it how much water we consume? Is it how much time we are stuck in traffic? Real human measurements, as well as the measurements of specific departments. But we also asked every general manager to come watch CompStat at LAPD, which, if you don't know, is a system that measures where crime is, maps it out. And it's not just about finding the data, it's about making the data accountable or leading to accountability. So if you ever go to one of these sessions, and we can arrange anybody who ever wants to go to one with LAPD, they're great to see. When you do see a cluster of 4, car break-ins in a 5-block radius, what you have is a chief, assistant chief, or a commander then saying to that captain, what are you doing to make sure that stops now? And it's that accountability that we're insisting every single department now CompStat itself. For instance, Animal Services had amazing measures. They could tell me every breed and mix of every dog that was coming in. They've started to do something they call BarkStat. And, from that, they hadn't yet sifted through with all that data what's going to be useful to them. So we're helping them do that. The Comptroller's Office is helping them. If there's any criticism, I think 90%, 95% of the comments we probably both got were incredibly positive. People said thank you. But for those who said, oh, this is too much data, and for us with the measurements, well, you picked these measurements. Between those two, we're going to be crunching them together where you're going to have enough data. If you know how to manipulate it yourself, you can create things like smartphone apps. You can do things like look at regression analysis and see, and there's going to be a whole host of people that can use that data in really creative ways. For the general public, we're going to have things where you can look at charts and see over time, are things getting better or worse? And if they're worse, Mr. Mayor, Council, what are you going to do to make those things improve? That's what this is about.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to you guys. We have microphones in the audience, am I correct in that? But let me ask one more question first, and that is of Mike Feuer. There's been a lot of reporting in the Los Angeles Times about the number of buildings in the city that are in danger of collapsing in the event of an earthquake. Everybody makes solemn statements about how we're going to do something about it, but the city apparently has refused to, the people who have counted up the buildings haven't given the information to the city. They say the city has known about this for years, but has refused to make a list. What are the, not to mention the kind of casualties that might occur if there were a terrible earthquake, but what about the legal consequences of that?
I think there are significant legal consequences. There are significant economic consequences. And there, of course, most importantly, are significant consequences to people every day. And I think the predicate for this is getting the information. I know that there is an effort underway right now. Our office has been in communication with the mayor's office on this, so we can collaborate to try to most effectively get the data in the first place. What we do with that data is going to be a real test of public policy and public policy makers in the city, because that information could lead to a tremendously expensive process of retrofitting certain buildings. We have to decide if that's the investment we want to make. It could lead to the valuation, increases in values in some areas of town, and it could lead to the de-escalation of values in other parts of town. And we have to decide exactly what we want to do about that. I heard the mayor on another public radio station, not to be named here, but there are two great stations. There are two great stations, I think that he appropriately pointed out that coming to grips with this issue is really tough, and we're going to have to, I think, first get the information and then call on the city's engineers to determine what it is that makes a city safe, and then decide what level of economic consequence we're going to impose and what level of money we're going to invest in the system. But for the moment, as much as one might want to think of this as a question of legal liability, I think it goes much deeper than that. There are communities that live with potential hazards all the time, from earthquakes to hurricanes. I was on the city council when, among others, Hal Bernstein and others on the city council were focused on taking very important steps that saved a lot of lives when the Northridge earthquake happened. This next generation of council members, the mayor and our office, are going to work together to assure that we provide that level of safety again.
Okay, let's go to the audience. And where are these microphones we've heard so much about? There they are. Let them know if you have a question, and they will hold the microphone in front of your face, but not turn it over to you. Okay. No, you don't get to hold the microphone.